Welcome to Sartor TV, an idea sharing platform founded by Russell Sartor, who's an author, investor, and CEO of Netcom Learning and AI Certs. Today, we have Kurt Strovink joining us. Kurt is a senior partner at McKinsey and co-author of A CEO for All Seasons. It's a book about how leaders can adapt through cycles of change, and he's here to tell us more. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I have been a senior partner at McKinsey for a number of years now. I think I'm getting close to the 3-decade mark at our firm. I think 29 years as of right now. And I have done a variety of things in our firm over time. I am leading our CEO practice globally, which is everything we do to develop sort of IP and insights for CEOs. Everything we do when we convene CEOs across the globe in different ways, in different forums, small and large. Everything that we do when we serve CEOs in different ways. We have different practices in our transformation practice and other aspects of what is the CEO role as they're trying to change companies, and how do you achieve full potential in that role, and also introducing CEOs to different CEOs at different times in their tenure. So everything in that space is something that I look after. I've also led our global insurance practice at one point, one of the 10 sort of client groups across the firm globally. I have had responsibility for leading our strategy and corporate finance practice, and also being a managing partner of our New York office at one point, going back further, and as well as being involved in a number of our committees, like the ones that evaluate our senior partners and think about how do you shape a partnership, through the senior folks and what they focus on and the like. So a lot of things at the firm, but my real passion has been to think about leaders and institutional change and the role of the CEO within that, which we feel is growing in importance. So that's what I've been focused on throughout my career, but particularly the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and what a great journey you've had at the firm.
It's been fun, and it's been a source of continual renewal, and the platform of the firm, not myself, gives lots of access to different places to learn. So yeah, it's been a really fun journey, and I have been blessed to see a lot of leaders do interesting things and shape companies in interesting ways as part of that. So it's been a privilege.
So tell us a little bit. We're going to talk about your book, your new book, CEO for All Seasons. Tell us what inspired you and your co-authors to write this book, and how does it build on some of your previous research in the journey of leadership?
Yeah, so it's a very it's a focused piece that is really kind of like a personal trainer, a handbook, and manual all in one around the 4 different stages of being a CEO. We see, when we call it the 4 seasons, we see there being a phase where you're a candidate. We call that stepping up. A period where you just start as a CEO. We call that starting strong. A period where you've been a CEO for a while and you're looking to shape the next S curve of a first, maybe you're actually at the end of your first S curve and you're thinking about a second act. We call that staying ahead. And then a period where you're actually looking to turn over or lay the conditions for the next generation. We call that sending it forward. And those 4 different seasons we think are important. They're recurring in the life cycle of a company and across CEO tenures. And the book was really about isolating those different stages and thinking about what are the imperatives of truly excellent leadership at each stage. And the reason we wrote it was often, we've done this before too, folks take a position on what does CEO excellence overall look like? What does leadership look like at its best? And we had done that in a previous book that was really broadly read. But we wanted to focus on each stage of the journey, to focus more on individual leadership development, how CEOs grow through the role, and what is the prescriptive advice that other great CEOs would give CEOs going through each of the stages. And that's important because we often learn most when we need to. And so while it's nice to take the full arc of time, focusing on the stage that we're in is sometimes the place where we learn most. And so we wanted to focus on those stages because we thought it was more practical. And we also wanted to paint a picture of the arc of the overall leadership journey and the learning opportunity before many CEOs, because we're struck by how often the great CEOs really learn and are learners in role. And so that was also part of the reason for it. And it grows on our journey of leadership book, as you asked for, asked about, because in the Journey of Leadership book, we thought a lot about how do leaders learn over time, and in particular, how the inner game of their leadership match their ability to lead folks outside. And we thought that we had a lot of stories in that book that we shared about how leaders need to govern themselves and learn to release themselves from certain assumptions and really lead themselves more fully in order to be able to lead others at the highest level. And so we were tracing that link between the inner game and the outer game in Journey of Leadership. So that was also about human development in a way. It was less about the arc over time and the seasons. It was more about the inner and outer, but I think we were still interested in different dimensions of human learning, growth, and development and role. And that Journey of Leadership book was written for all leaders. The 4 seasons and the CEO for all seasons is written for CEOs, but also we believe is very applicable to leaders in any role who are starting a role and developing through the middle years. And we also think it's relevant for board members who look over the development of leaders, including CEOs and prospective CEOs.
Mm-hmm. So with so much research available today around leadership, what gap do you feel this book needed to fill?
I think one gap was advice specific to the tenure that people faced, meaning something that focused on different imperatives at different stages. I think that's not as well described, an area. There's a lot of research about CEO leadership. There's a lot of stories of individual leaders, but there's less focused advice from 100 of the leading CEOs at each stage of their journey. And we went deep and interviewed people about not what do you think leadership looked like overall, but what did you do when you were coming up for potentially being considered as a CEO? How did you learn? How did you grow? Or let's focus you on that first year. How did you think about doing your listening tour? Now, how did you interact with the board? How did you think about nailing some of the firsts in your investor meeting and other things? And let's focus on that second phase, or what we call season 2. Or when you were in your middle years, how did you think about when it was right to evolve the strategy that you set in your early years? When was the right pivot point? Did you have to build on that? How did you avoid complacency, coasting? How did you renew your leadership and your team over time? Those kinds of questions. Or in the 4th season, how do you think about setting up the next generation? How do you give the gift that only you can give as a CEO to set up the next generation? How do you get out of your way if you have a great reputation, but it's not about you anymore? Those kind of questions were where we went deep. And because we focused the conversations at each stage, I think there's a lot more practical, applicable lessons for folks going through those different stages. I think that was the need that we were trying to meet in the literature that didn't exist. A second is, among the few books that do talk about stages of development, we wanted to work with a group of CEOs that unquestionably had created true excellence. They weren't just the CEOs that we could get access to, if you will, but they met a series of conditions that were really strong total return to shareholders over time, and the top group of that, adjusted by the sectors they were in. So we were thinking about excess CRS in each of their different industries at certain points in time, because that varies, as you know, a lot. We looked at those who were widely admired as well, so not just quantitative factors. And we zeroed in on a population that we truly thought was the best of the best. And we wanted to study that group, not because we were being focused only on implications and learnings that come from the very best, but because we thought some of the things that you observe when you look at what most CEOs face and some of the struggles they face is not the same as what you see among the people that adapted most quickly to those challenges. And so we thought another contribution, in addition to focusing on the seasons and the different stages, was actually focusing on a cohort group that was truly outstanding, and understanding what is true in that group, and how might that be different from what's true in the general or average population. One example of that is we did not find a sophomore slump for some of the leading CEOs as they went through their time in their second year, for example, of starting. We actually found that they performed as strongly in their second years as they did in their first. The average does hit a sophomore slump, but the truly excellent CEOs don't. And we wanted to understand why. What are they doing? How are they learning more quickly that avoided that? So those are some of the things that were part of the reason for doing this: stages, excellent cohort, and then maybe questioning a few of the myths that are out there that we thought might be different for believing CEOs.
And just the title of the book, right? A CEO of all seasons. That metaphor. Tell us a little bit about that. How that took shape.
Yeah, it was. The metaphor was basically we were interested in this notion of a recurring cycle, and part of the reason we were was we think when you think about talent and development over time, and the broadest aperture, that's what's happening inside of organizations. Leaders are growing. Some of them are becoming, very senior executive leaders. Some become CEOs. But even for a CEO, it's tempting to think about it's all consuming as a CEO. But even the CEO's time ends and another leader comes up. And so we wanted to express the cycle over time and look at that in a broader way, because we thought taking that broader aperture was helpful for boards looking across full CEO tenures. It was helpful for employees whose tenure can be longer than a single CEO. It's part of a leadership factory where you're developing many leaders over time, not just people who become CEOs. We thought it'd be relevant for stakeholders who were looking at companies beyond a single CEO's tenure. And so we wanted to explore, if you will, human development over time and those cultures that can create CEOs that are skilled, not one, but multiple. And how do you coach the next generation to be able to do that? So that was the real jumping off point for wanting to focus on this idea of the seasons. We were also a little bit, for those academically, minded, we did think a little bit about Joseph Campbell's idea of the eternal cycle of return and, this kind of concept that things repeat over time. And we were interested in that as being partly true for CEOs as well. So that was the original thought. And then we called it a CEO for all seasons as a way to express the fact that you learn and develop through time.
Sure. And so the cyclical view of leadership, what would you say makes it different or more effective than maybe a more traditional linear one?
I think when we think about linear elements of development, we might think about just best practices, and we might not locate those in a particular point in time. I think when we think about cycles of development or seasons, we realize that there are certain moments where you can tap into maybe the full potential of your role as a CEO or as a leader, and the context may be most suited for that kind of leadership at that point in time. So I think what you get through the seasons is by thinking about what is the relationship between the external environment or the needs of the company at a certain moment and the leadership that you provide or can, rise to at that moment, as opposed to thinking about all leadership works for all settings and situations and timeframes. And so as one example, we find that when in the early years, when you're coming into a role, the organization is expecting change. And it's actually unfreezing a little bit. It's open to rethinking things. And part of what CEOs can do is really use themselves as almost a foil, their transition as a foil, to open the organization up to questions, to ask things that haven't been asked in years. And those CEOs who are skilled at using their listening tour as a way to take advantage of this unfreezing moment in the organization to question things, to set new agendas, can be extremely effective. That same skill used much later in their tenures might be off key. They've been in role for a while. It would be odd to do that at that point. It would be almost questioning things that are in motion. Perhaps it would have a different. It would need to have a different cast. In fact, it's usually about renewing a strategy and making some refinements to it, and developing what we call a second S curve later in your middle years. But at the beginning, it's all about taking advantage of the fact that the audience is listening. People are open. They're willing to think things in new ways. And you as a CEO can take advantage of that environmental moment to do a lot of good for the company. We sometimes talk about the fact that executive transitions and CEO transitions in particular, it's not about the individual CEO. It's not about them personally. It's a public good. It's for the benefit of the organization. And how do you play your role as a leader best for the benefit of the company as you go through that transition? A lot of people think about it just as, what are my preferences? What do I want to do? How do I want to live? Those are all nice questions, but it's really about, what does the organization need? What can I uniquely do with this moment? How do I live into this moment where people are open? How can we use the energy of that to create new ways of thinking and maybe challenge some orthodoxies and start some new directions? And so one of the things that helps us with a seasonal view is a better matching of leadership to context.
Yeah. What would you say surprised you the most in the data as you were interviewing and surveying all these different executives for your research?
Yeah, I would say a couple things stood out as being surprising. One was, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but it just, the degree to which it was true was really gripping. Most of the really stellar CEOs through all seasons, the ones that are a CEO for all seasons, not just one season, they're continuous learners. They adapt. They don't get complacent. They constantly question. I think that was the degree to which that's true. The degree to which they, as one CEO that we've talked about, the CEO of HCA, Sam Hazen says, he always plays as if he's behind. He's always acting like it's halftime and he's behind. And no matter how well he's doing, and that company has done extremely well, he always thinks we're behind. There's this, everybody has their own version of that story. They never stay complacent. They're always learning. They're pushing themselves to think about what's next. Doug Peterson at SAP was a similar, discussion around the need to continually learn. Satya Nadella at Microsoft was similar in that he was talking about, learn at all cultures, not know at all cultures, and trying to role model that as a CEO. So this constant adaptation, lack of being confident, and like I fully arrived, constantly questioning, constantly learning, and role modeling that as a CEO. Maybe it didn't surprise me that would be in the equation, but the degree to which that was true through all the seasons was actually inspirational, because it was a bit humbling to remember that even some of the people you think about as legends are still constantly trying to get better. That was true of Jamie Dimon as well, when he talked a lot about, organizations, large organizations have a tendency to rest. They come to stasis unless you constantly push as a CEO to get to higher ground. And I think, he has a series of ways of doing that with the questions that he asks and the way that he interrogates business leaders about their performance. He almost makes that a high art. But I think the central insight he has is that large organizations, even famously effective and accomplished ones, will tend to get inertial unless we constantly renew, ask the tough questions, and the CEO needs to role model that. So the degree of learning and lack of complacency was one big thing I think that stood out. Another is the degree to which, as I mentioned, we don't see a sophomore slump for some of the best CEOs. They don't hit a period after their first year where they go down a little bit. It's not quite a J curve. And I think that's not because they're perfect. And they would be the first to say that they aren't, but that they adapted to, learned, and changed faster, perhaps, than other CEOs. And I think, it's very clear from talking to the 100 CEOs that we went deep in, 4, 5, 6 interviews across multiple hours of discussion. These are not, they may be proud people in some way, but they're not complacent, and they don't see themselves as faultless. They were very, very honest about shortcomings, things they had to learn, et cetera. But I do think that their cycle of learning was faster, and they were quicker, and they adapted more quickly. So those would be a few things that I would say at least surprised me.
And in your research, which season did you find tends to trip up CEOs the most?
I would say, there are moments of opportunity in all seasons, but if I were to pick one or two, I would probably say something in the third season and something in the fourth season. In the third season, when you've been a CEO for a while, I think one of the things that can trip you up is, not deciding that you have to pivot to higher ground to renew a strategy or a direction, and getting locked into the first strategy that you might have shaped, maybe a very good strategy, in your second season when you started. And it's hard for CEOs to decide when's the right timing for me to, this first strategy has played out. I can't continue to coast on it. I've got to add now another S curve to my first one. I think that can trip sometimes people up. They feel like either I've done the strategy, check. I don't want to do it again necessarily. Why would I revisit? Or I'm going to do it again, and it would be in contradiction to what I've said before. I've spent so much time for years burning this new strategy in and talking about it. How can I reverse myself? I'll be seen as inconsistent. And they lack either the idiom or the objectivity from the outside, or the creativity to know how to match a second S curve to the first one, where you're building on it. You're not abandoning everything in your first strategy, but you're certainly evolving it with learnings from the last couple of years. I think that ends up being a blind spot. Sometimes people coast too long on their first S curve of strategy. And a real discriminating feature, I think, of some of the best CEOs is they know they need to pivot back to this idea of not being complacent. They find a way to get objectivity into the system, whether it's through challenger roles internally, looking at analogies across industries, asking what leading companies in their industry are doing, external perspectives of various kinds that they pull in. They find a way to constantly raise that next S curve and have the courage, even if they're still doing really well, to pivot to higher ground before it's too late. So that would be something I would say in that third season. I think in the fourth, maybe one limiter or thing that we often see is, and it's a little Shakespearean, but I think in proportion to how well regarded and famous CEOs are, it's harder to get out of their own way at the end of their tenures to set up the next generation. And even if they're really legends, it's even harder to do that. And it's the ultimate last test of somebody who's been extremely accomplished in role and is almost a household name as a CEO. How do you set up the next generation, get out of the way, allow the next generation to be them, not you? All that, the art of how you lead that, I think, is a really beautiful finishing step for CEOs, and those that can clear that final bar, I think, teach us all a lot.
Can you just actually step back and briefly walk us through what's required from a leader in each phase or in each of those 4 seasons?
Yeah, there's a variety of things that are required. In the first season, the stepping up phase that I mentioned earlier, it's a variety of things. It is first and foremost, it's beginning to learn in areas that may be new to you and thinking about how you have to grow into ultimately being a CEO. There may be a part of the business that you've run that you know very well. There may be another part that you haven't run that you need to learn. So there's a learning program and a question of how do you broaden your sights. Sometimes that takes the form of being on a board, another board. Sometimes not necessarily a for-profit board, but it can be somewhere where you experience how a board relates to a CEO, where you're not. It's not your company. Sometimes it's learning another business for a period of time or rotating through that business. Sometimes it's taking on an enterprise-wide initiative where you learn other parts of the organization. So I think there's one element in this first phase is about the learning model that you have and the course that you almost assign yourself. I think there's also a period of figuring out, as Robert Smith of Vista said, everybody has a right hand and a left hand. The right hand's stronger, for example, for most. What is your left hand, the thing that's weaker? Like, how are you going to work on that? Are you asking people the questions of where your development lies? Are you being candid and honest about that and trying to be open and vulnerable? We see that a lot in this first phase. So learning self education and openness as to where you can develop would be one big thing. And then doing all those things while also not abandoning your day job and delivering on the results. We do sometimes see CEOs that get involved in deep learning programs, but they kind of leave the business a little bit coasting, and then that causes problems. And so it's doing all of that while still excelling in role and leading the company well. And then there's a series of things around which we have in the book, about how to work with peers who might also be coming up for being considered as a CEO, how to be collaborative, how to be enterprise-wide, how to not be self-focused. A variety of strong learnings and a lot of counsel from the leading CEOs on how not to play politics. Gail Kelly of Westpac talked a lot about the fact that she would sit down her potential successors and say, I don't want to see any of you undermine the other. And that's actually going to be a condition of being considered for the role. And I think there's a lot of learning about how do you succeed as a person among peers as opposed to a single individual. So those would be some of the things that matter in that first phase, that first season. I think in the second season, it's all about using this moment in time where the organization is unfrozen, if you will, to set an agenda, doing a really great listening tour, being thoughtful about how you do the listening tour. What questions are you going to ask? One of my favorite questions that we often counsel CEOs to ask is, what are people not telling me that I need to hear? It's a great way to open people up, show your vulnerability, learn, create a space where they can share what maybe other people are saying, but not maybe themselves. But I think listening and gathering what the organization is really telling you, even if it doesn't say it first, is a super important aspect of that listening tour. So I think shaping the listening tour in the right way is a very valuable and important part of that second season. It's also thinking about nailing your first, as we call it, doing bold things well in your first investor meeting, in your first team meeting, in your first analyst call. Greg Case with Aon talked about the fact that he showed up at Aon and there was an investor call that was on the calendar a month out, and he felt obligated to do it. And you realized, in retrospect, he should have canceled it. Nail the first one, make sure it's yours, not inherited. So nailing your first is super important in that second season as well. I think we also find that doing only the things that you can do, being bold, figuring out your strategy, and making sure it's sufficiently bold to matter to cut through the clutter is an art as well. And you spend a lot of time trying to make sure you get objective views of that. Sometimes that's harder, by the way, for CEOs that are promoted from the inside than CEOs coming from the outside. We can talk more about that. But those are some of the themes that are important in season 2. Creating objective views, getting full mileage out of what the organization has to teach you, and making sure you nail your firsts and you establish a bold strategy. I think in the third season, there's a number of things that are important. I think enhancing your learning agenda is critical. Having extra things that you're learning and teaching yourself and your senior team is very important. There's lots of ways of doing that, but being self-conscious about not assuming that you've got it figured out, and constantly learning across industries, often analogies to other industries that are doing interesting things or companies within those industries, and having an explicit, model for yourself and your team around how are we going to continue to learn in a practical way is one thing. Taking an outsider's perspective is super important. Finding a way not to be convinced of everything you tell yourself internally and your team does, but challenging yourself and building in institutional ways to challenge tends to be very important in this season. Thinking about that next S curve. When do you pivot from the first S curve to the next is very important. That ends up being sometimes something that is done too late. But for leading CEOs, I think they time that well and they do it with humility. The world has evolved, we're going to evolve with it. There's some things that worked in our first wave of strategy. We're going to refine that and build on the learnings. And then I think the other thing you tend to do in this third season, or we see the leading CEOs do, is they future proof their organizations. They think about what's around the corner, what might be important that is not yet on the radar screen. Reese Hastings at Netflix talked about 10 years out, what's going to get us, and we'll do working sessions where we really step back with this whole senior team and almost war game, envision possible futures and what could get in the way. I think everybody has their own way of doing that, but I think you have to look around corners. You have to think more broadly, and you have to motivate the organization out of its tendency, if it's a large organization, to get to rest. We saw good examples of their own styles, their own formulas, of Jamie Dimon doing that with his questioning style with business leaders and meetings, or even Michael Dell doing that in his businesses, where there was a moment of testing and prodding and making sure that that folks were taking the high ground on new strategies and directions, and that tends to be very important within that third season. And then finally, in the fourth season, I would say it's a variety of things. It's first of all, it's deciding when there's a finite date when you're going to leave, and that seems simple and basic, but it's amazing how many CEOs do not decide at a date certain, and how many things are set in motion when they do that helps them and others take the baton and lead to the next level. I think there's also an element in this phase of preparing the successors, giving them development opportunities, thinking about how to give them as much as you can a full view of the field before being considered to be CEO. and the board sufficient surface area to learn and meet and know the successors. Sometimes with you not there with the board. And then, of course, there's a lot on how do you hand over with grace? How do you think about not contradicting the person when they're named? Lots of learnings about should you consider being a chair or not? Is it time to leave? I think 80% of the cases we believe you should leave and not become chair. There's some strong exceptions to that. But there's that part of the journey. And then there really is, asking yourself as a CEO, what do I love most about this role? And even if I'm going to move outside of this role, how do I recapture some of those other elements in the other parts of my life? Because there is life after being a CEO. And we've even thought about writing something on the 5th season about life after for CEOs as well. So those would be some of the themes in that 4th critical season about setting up the next generation that are important.
Yeah. And on that, what have you seen as a sort of truly strategic and selfless CEO succession plan? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, one CEO that I happen to be actually working with now is doing something very interesting where they're setting up a series of almost steps of a process for development, and they're being very conscious about the successors that could be CEO, and they're looking at it as what's the growth of each of these human beings, these leaders in role, and how do I give them opportunities in their current vertical leadership, and also how do I think about stepping up and giving them horizontal leadership responsibilities, and they're taking it on as their mission, really, to develop not just one successor, but multiple people as part of a growing leadership factory. And I think that's one of the things that great looks like, is taking responsibility for the overall leadership quotient of the organization, and particularly for the top leaders, having individual development plans for them that grows their capabilities, and that also ladders up to your overall strategy and gives you throw weight against what you're trying to achieve as an overall organization. I think another component of what great looks like is not assuming that the CEO that follows you is going to be like you. Larry Fink at BlackRock was famous for saying, beware of replicants, and trying to find, people who are like you. You've actually got to do the opposite. You got to find people who will complement sometimes you when you're a CEO, but also will be their own people. And they may have different skills, again, back to this idea of seasons, context, that you don't have. And you need to make sure you make space for that, and almost assume to start that the next CEO is not going to be like you, and for good reason. And so, his strong suggestion for CEOs was, do not recruit and build people in your image. It's very dangerous to the long-term development of organizations. And you're much better thinking about complementarity of skills. So those would be some of the things that I think are important, and what good looks like in that last season.
Mm-hmm. And just turning to technology and AI, with AI dominating so many things right now, what qualities do CEOs need to lead through this and some of the technological disruptions that we might see from this technology and AI?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating time to lead as a CEO, as you said, given how much is changing in the technology front. I think a couple qualities are particularly important. One is back to this idea of this learning mindset, constantly growing, constantly learning. I think it's fair to say that the space is evolving so quickly that you really need curiosity and learning and an ability to learn. And I do see, across CEOs, I would say that, this is not in the book, but more broadly, there's probably different segments of CEOs. There's some out there, probably about a third, that they look at some of the technology changes in AI and agentic AI that's coming, and they see it as the province of IT, and they know it's super important, but they see it as sort of the next level of something important that needs to happen there, that one of their very capable team members will handle and drive. There's probably another third that says, no, this is much broader than that. It is a realignment of technology and business. Technology is fused across business now. I need to actually develop the skills of business leaders that are technologically savvy as well as technology leaders who understand our business. I need more translators. I need more, product managers that have this bilingual skill, the second muscle, as we sometimes call it. And they understand that it's their job as CEOs to build that new agile operating model. And then I think there's probably a third that are saying, actually, it's bigger than that still. It's all of that agile operating model between technology and business for sure, but it's also going to change the workforce in the future. There's strategic workforce planning is going to change. The skills that I need are going to be different. The shape of the pyramid is going to be different. The value proposition to people might be different. How I organize is probably going to be different. And therefore, I need as a CEO to look across technology, business, but also people and talent. And I have to shape that full stack. And this is actually a CEO concern if there ever was one, because it's so integrative. And so how could this escape the senior most officer of a company? And they are saying to themselves, there's no model yet or plan, but I'm getting out in front of my management team and my industry, and I'm looking at this in new ways myself, obviously with my head of technology and sometimes my CHRO and my CFO too, because the implications of this for the capital and people and our expenses and our investments are huge. So I see people in each of those areas. And so back to your question of what is the role of the CEO in technology and AI today, I would say it varies by the CEO, but I believe that it should be in categories 2 and 3. I think if it's the province of IT alone, it's a dangerous area to be in for the long term. I think if you're busy thinking about resetting an agile model between technology and business, that's an important start. I think if you're also sweeping in the people and talent and shape of the company and the operating model, I think that's even better as a position to be in. But I think we do see that the CEO role in AI is becoming a very important one. And I would say even in the last 100 days, there's been, I feel across the world with CEOs, a greater shift to what's my personal role in this equation.
Yeah, which was going to be my next question to you, is just how do you see AI reshaping the role of the CEO itself?
Yeah, I think part of it, you can role model learning, real-time learning and development. I think that it's almost a case study of that for a CEO, which is a great thing to high grade everybody's learning and the assumption that you're going to be learning new things for all of your leaders and you can role model that yourself. That's one effect of AI. I think another is that there's, and we talk about this in some of the thoughts we have in the book around the future role of the CEO. I think there's probably a greater element of trying to vision multiple futures and trying to think about what are some of the no regrets moves you can take now to allow you to have option value in the future. And that's something that's always true in strategy, but I think AI is forcing it to be really critical to think through now. I think there's also a question of where do you want to lead? Where do you want to sort of match others and where do you want to follow? And where do you think across your business, given the context of your business, you can do each of those, but it's dangerous to be always in follow mode. So that's another thing I think that it changes the role of the CEO on. I think there's also a question around, there's just a lot of ethical questions and, I would call it moral reasoning for CEOs that AI forces in some of the corner cases. And I think CEOs learning to think through second and third order consequences of first order actions. That's always true as a leader, but I think it's again getting more important to sort through with respect to AI. So there's a lot of different things at once, and I think those that will question assumptions, but also be practical about the fact that we don't have time to be philosophers, but we have to take some thinking that's deeper as well as pragmatic in order to shape the right course here is what CEOs are being called to do, in this modern era we're in.
Yeah. And, the book itself, it's great because it's like a practical handbook. It's not just narrative. You've got tools and assessments in there. Tell us a little bit more about, some of these tools, assessments, checklists, and how CEOs can use this to help them along their journey.
Yeah, we've included a number of tools and checklists, as you mentioned, in order to make this as practical as possible. We don't think that every CEO, wants a long workbook, but ways to actually reflect and create space for reflection that's very pragmatic and practical. We have hundreds of techniques and tools arrayed into these 4 seasons and grouped into 4 imperatives by season. What we try to do in our exercises is create some self-reflection, a way for CEOs to ask themselves, or people who are working closely with them, or conciliaries to them, or even board members, to gut check some of the things that they're doing. How complete is their focus? Are they wearing the glove evenly of all the things they need to do at each stage? And so it's meant as being a space for reflection, and an invitation for multiple people to get around this question. There's also some things that allow CEOs to ask by way of survey other people for their input, which can be very helpful for not only reflecting yourself, but getting other people's views. And we also have a survey that we pioneered, we show results of in the book, on blind spots of CEOs for each of the tenures. And we're very interested in what CEOs, what their blind spots were at each of the different seasons. And one of the things that's interesting is that 100% of the CEOs believed that they were doing better than their direct reports believed in our survey. So everybody was higher than the people that report to them in terms of their estimation of themselves across various skills. And in 80% of the cases, the CEOs were ahead of the board. So it's just human nature. It's nothing to do with CEOs being, purposely self-congratulatory or anything. I just think we tend to, there's a Lake Wobegon effect, in CEOs with respect certainly to direct reports, but also the board members on how well they're doing. So you can take some of these survey results, have them across, many CEOs, but you can also use them to reflect on where are your blind spots. What are some of the things that you may not be aware of, or maybe you're giving yourself too much credit for having mastered. And that can also be helpful and corrective.
Yeah, that's great. And finally, as you think about the seasons of leadership, what's one piece of advice you hope every CEO carries with them, no matter what season they're in?
Yeah, my hope would be, one of the things that we talk about in the introduction to the book is that there's a red thread that goes through all seasons, even though there are very specific imperatives by season that we noticed from all these great CEOs that we had the privilege of spending a lot of time with. And that's this idea of being other focused on the needs of the company, not just the needs of oneself. Focusing on what can I do, given my role at this stage, to unlock the potential of this organization. We call it a red thread of sort of servant leadership, and it's sort of an other focus. But there are different things at each tenure that you can do to build the muscle and the strength of the organization as a whole. So as one illustration of that, in the early phase when you're a candidate, there's ways of conducting yourself so that you're a first among peers as opposed to just an aspirant for office. And you can build stronger teamwork during that period of time. And no matter if you become CEO or not, it'll be to the advantage of the organization. In a similar way, in the second season, if you conduct yourself in a way that you're a foil for the organization discovering what its next strategy is going to look like, with a very artful set of questions and interactions around the listening tour, you can build a whole bunch of awareness and understanding and questioning that really increases the sort of insight and strength and conviction of the organization as a whole. And if you can, in the 4th season, to jump all the way to the end, if you can set up the next generation and do something that is selfless, maybe it damages your reputation a little bit in the near term because you do something like maybe you deal with a really troubling executive that needs to go, everybody knows it, but you need to take the bullet and make it happen. Set up the next generation, you will create much greater execution for the next leaders, the next CEO, and the organization will eventually thank you for that, usually 2-3 years down the road. Maybe in the first year, there may be some turbulence. Those are all examples of selfless acts with the organization in mind as a whole. And I think my one hope would be that people see the recurring element of servant leadership, different modalities of that by season, and that they can see that there's kind of a red thread underneath this, and that there's a broader project of leadership that's about helping the whole, not just ourselves.
Well, Kurt, this was great insight and a great book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
And we'll see you next time on Starter TV.